like to share a couple of thoughts with you tonight, if I may, brothers and sisters, and share a testimony with you about missionary work. I'm very much involved in missionary work right now. As we get into that, let me just share one concept with you. I had an experience some years ago when I was a bishop. A young man came up to me and he said, "Bishop, I want you to tell me why we go to all the meetings we go to." He said, "I've got to go to seminary and Sunday school and all these meetings. I'm tired of it. You tell me why we go to these meetings." I thought about that driving down here tonight. And I thought back as that young man asked me that question to an experience I had as a youth when I went to a fireside. And it was one of those firesides where there was a real fire. And so it was a real live fireside, and the fire was going. The man got up and was going to be our speaker that night, and he said, "I'm going to talk tonight about why you go to all the meetings you go to, and I'm going to talk about the fellowshipping program of the church and why we encourage you to fellowship your friends." And then he proceeded to walk across the room to the fire, and he got this poker out, and he reached over with this two-pronged poker, and he grabbed a coal out of the fire. Great, big, beautiful, red, glowing coal. He set it down on the hearth, and then he walked back to his seat, and he sat down across his legs and started to watch that coal. Well, there wasn't anything else for us to do, so we sat there and watched the coal, too. We watched it for about 20 minutes. That coal, as you would imagine, started to get dimmer and dimmer and dimmer, and pretty soon it started to smoke, you know how they do, and it got black and black. Pretty soon it was just coal. And he got up after 20 minutes and walked across the room and then picked it up with his bare hand. That was impressive. I was impressed with that. He grabbed it with his bare hand, and he walked over to the fire, and he set this coal back in the fire. Then he walked back and sat down. Didn't say a thing. Watched it for about 5 minutes, and as you would imagine, the coal started to get a little brighter and a little brighter, and pretty soon it was just as red and beautiful as all the other coal. And then he got up and he said, "That's my talk, amen." It was the greatest talk I ever heard. That talk had more impact on me than I think any talk I'd heard up until that point. That's why, brothers and sisters, we go to all the meetings we go to. We don't go to sacrament meeting on the third Sunday so the High Council can put us to sleep. We go to that sacrament meeting so that we can bask in each other's light. These meetings are stoking experiences. We come not because there's going to be a great speaker or a bad speaker. We come because, and I say this to preamble my talk, we come because we can be together and we can sit by each other and we can share in each other's strengths, and our coal is stoked. And we can go out the rest of the week and feel that strength and just make it fun. Well, I answered that young man's question when he was asking and pointing why do we go to the meeting, and I asked him the question, "What did you have for dinner 3 weeks ago on Thursday night?" He said, "Bishop, I can't remember what I had for dinner. That's a dumb question." And I said, "Well, did it do you any good?" He said, "Well, of course it did me some good. It kept me alive another day." And I said, "That's right. That's why we go to all these meetings, because it keeps us alive another day spiritually." So I would hope, brothers and sisters, that we're here tonight to be stoked a little bit, not only by the speakers, but by just sitting together and feeling of each other's life. And that's what people feel when they come to the church for the first time. You'll not long remember what you hear tonight or what you hear in many sacrament meetings, but you never forget what you feel. And that's the power of the fellowshipping program. People will come into your home for a family home evening, and they'll feel something there. They don't know what it is yet. The Spirit of God. They'll go away from that and they'll begin to want more of it. We had an experience I'd like to share with you, brothers and sisters, that taught me a whole lot about our being missionaries. When we were in Portland, I was mentioned I had an opportunity of being in a stake presidency there. And every once in a while we would have a meeting that was devoted entirely for missionary work. And we'd get up and give talks on how important it was for the members to be missionaries. You've heard that. From the time President Kay said that for the first time, we've heard it thousands of times. Every member is a missionary. Well, we do that and we get all excited in state conference, and the general authorities come and we get all worked up about doing missionary work, and it lasts like the flu, about 24 hours. And Monday morning, an interesting thing happens. Like every Monday morning, the sun comes up. We're back in our house, and we're not around those 2,000 people in the state conference anymore, and we're not about to do it. We came home one night after one of these Saturday night sessions, my wife and I had just given a talk. I thought I'd just given a marvelous dissertation on missionary work and why we ought to do it. And I came back very frustrated, and I was stomping around the house, and I was saying, "Sweetheart, why can't we get the people of this state to just walk across the street to their neighbors and ask them to come into their home for a home evening? Tell them they love them. Why won't they do that?" And I was stomping around exhibiting all kinds of righteous indignation. And she just had kind of an interesting smile on her face. And then I made the mistake of asking one more question. I said, sweetheart, why do you suppose we haven't done it? That was a mistake. She pointed her finger at me, I'll never forget, and she put her finger right in my nose, as only my wife can do, and she said, would you like me to tell you why we haven't done it yet, President? And I said, yeah, tell me why. And she said, because you're afraid to. I was offended by that. Afraid? Me, your dragon slayer? President Smith? I'm not afraid of anything. I think you forget. I was on a mission for 2 years in England. I've knocked on thousands of doors. I'm not afraid. You're afraid, President. Now, wait a minute, sweetheart. You forgot. I have been on a mission. I know how to knock on doors. I dare you to go across the street right now and invite the McDowells over to a home evening. Now, wait a minute, sweetheart. Let's talk it over. I wasn't about to go across. And you know why? I was scared. I was afraid to. And for the first time in my life, I recognized the emotion that had kept me from going across my street. Well, as I remembered that, I asked myself the question, well, why wasn't I afraid in England? Why wasn't I afraid when I knocked on the doors in England? You know why, brothers and sisters? I didn't live on any of those streets in England. If I had a bad experience on one of those streets, I never had to go back. I'd go to another street, wouldn't we, missionary? You bet. But on my street, if I go across the street and embarrass myself with my neighbor, what happens? I have to go to work early in the morning and come home late at night. Well, it's different when we're here at home, isn't it? Well, I started to learn something about myself. I remembered that the way I got over that fear in the mission field was I had to go before the Lord and get a little extra help. I also learned something about the fact you can't be afraid in front of your family. Dad's not afraid, is he? So I got up in front of my family the next Monday night. We had a little home evening. I have 4 gorgeous daughters and a son. Named him Joseph. Can you believe that? I figured if my parents could do it to me, I'd do it to him. So. The only time that's difficult is when they take roll at BYU, and then it's really exciting. I stood before my family on that Monday night, and I said, you know, I've been thinking that we really ought to go across the street and maybe take some cookies to our neighbors and sing a song and tell them we love them and see if they wouldn't like to come to home evening. You know, children aren't afraid. They got so excited about that. Oh, Dad, that's great. Let's do it tonight, Dad. Let's do it tonight. Well, I thought we'd do it next Monday night. Oh, no, Dad, let's do it tonight. And I looked at my wife and her fingers started to come up and I said, all right, we'll do it tonight. So we prepared some cookies, and we learned a song to sing, and then we came into the front room, and we had a word of prayer together, and then we began the arduous journey across the street. You have any idea how wide the streets are in Portland? It took us about 45 minutes to get over there. We walked up on the doorstep of our neighbors right directly across the street, and my children, you know, pushing Dad. Dad's not afraid. I deserved an Oscar for my performance that night. They pushed me up to the door, and I rang the doorbell, and the door opened, and Mr. McDowell opened the door, and he said, yes. And I said, Mr. McDowell, I'm Hyrum Smith, and this is my wife and my children, and we want you to know we love you. And we prepared a song and made some cookies, and we'd like to come in and give you those cookies and sing a song. Could we do that? What do you suppose his reaction was? He had to go ask his wife for permission for it. And he went back, he said, just a minute, he went back in the house, and I could hear him whispering through the door, and he said, sweetheart, the people from across the street are out here. She loves me. He said they've got some cookies, they want to come in and sing a song. Is that all right? Well, sure, that's all right, come on in. So he came back to the door and said, come on in, and in walked the leper. We felt like lepers because that's how they looked at us as we walked in the house that night. We sang our song and presented our cookies and just had a marvelous experience. And we invited them to come to a home evening, and to our horror, they said yes. They said, yeah, we'd love to do that. I think they were mostly curious. They were really curious after we got through. And so we then left, and we told them we loved them again, and we left and walked back across the street. It didn't take us near as long to get back, so didn't get over there. What do you suppose Dad did when we got back into the safety and warmth of our living room? I stood before my family. Wasn't that easy? There was nothing to that, was there? Oh, Dad, that was great. And then we started to have some marvelous experiences on our street, brothers and sisters, with our neighbors, and saw some of them join the church, and saw them start to participate in the marvelous blessings that we have in the church. Brothers and sisters, I think if we all recognize that there's just a little bit of fear in doing missionary work. In my case, there's a whole lot of fear. When we came to Ventura as mission president, we found that the street in Ventura was just as wide as the street was in Portland. And we had to do it the same way. Pray, cookie, the whole business. Dad up front. And then we went across the street, and we've had a great experience in Ventura. We've got a number of people going to church, and they're coming to our home for family home meetings. It's just a great, great thing. Our kids aren't afraid. There are 37 kids that live on our street in Ventura, and they all live at our house now. I don't know if that's good or bad. I think we're carrying a little too far, but they are all at our house, and I've come home many times, all 37 kids running through. It's like a jungle. Brothers and sisters, that is the exciting thing about missionary work. If it's going to happen and happen well, we have got to be in condition for it. The greatest statement I've ever heard on missionary work or on the fellowshipping program is this: alone in the moonlight is better when you're not. Think about that, will you? Alone in the moonlight is better when you're not. Now, you brethren, if you're standing up on a cliff and you're overlooking a beautiful moonlit scene, you can enjoy that to a degree, but if your wife is with you, wow. And if your family is with you, double wow. And if your whole street's there, triple wow. Well, that's the essence, brothers and sisters, of getting exciting about sharing the gospel. How many of you saw the movie Star Wars? Fair amount. You know why I saw Star Wars? I had to. I couldn't carry on a decent conversation at work anymore. Why? I didn't know who Darth Vader was. I didn't know who 3CPO was, or Chewbacca. I know who they are now. They're my heroes. I could go to work then and carry on a pretty decent conversation. Do you have any idea the impact in the world that the members of the church got as excited about sharing their testimonies of the truth as we were about talking about Star Wars? Incredible. Well, that's what the prophet's asking. I'd like to talk tonight, if I may, brothers and sisters, about a conditioning process that gets us from where we are to the point where we can, with some courage, walk across that 400-mile street and tell our neighbors we love them. Brethren, if you want an interesting experience, on Monday, go to the man that you work next to, next office, whatever, walk in, shake his hand, and say, "Sam, I love you." See what he does. Now, he may look at you a little funny at first, but after about 10 days of that, he'll get hooked on it. And you'll forget one of those days, and he's going to come into your office and say, "How come you didn't tell me you love me today?" He is going through withdrawal. Now, you ladies know what that's like. If your husband doesn't tell you that he loves you about 4 or 5 times a day, you go through withdrawal. I can tell by the way the phone rings, brothers and sisters, it's my wife and I've missed. I just pick up the phone and say, "I love you," and she says, "Thanks," and I hang it back up. In fact, it got to the point in our family where I bought her a watch for Christmas last year. Great little one of these digital watches. You know, you push it once and it gives you the time. You push it twice, gives you the date. You push it 3 times and it punches out, "I love you." Great little watch. Saved me a big phone bill. But we all do that, don't we? We go through withdrawal if we don't get it, and when we start to achieve that love in our lives, we bask in it. That's what the whole fellowshipping process is about. Well, how do we get in condition for that? I suggest to you tonight, brothers and sisters, that if we are going to be decent emissaries of our Father in heaven, we have got to be the best at what we do. I don't think there is any greater compliment that can be paid anyone in any field than for a peer to say he or she is really good. You ever heard that? You've heard it of actors and actresses. You've heard it of media people. Boy, he is good. You ever seen him? He is something. Well, I believe that if we are the best at what we do, that says just a whole lot to a lot of people. Well, if we're going to be the best at what we do, we have also got to be the best in our responsibility as sons and daughters of God in acquiring testimonies of the gospel. We have got to have our own testimony. It starts out with a little bit of effort on our part. Prayer, learning, study, thinking, experimenting with the gospel, and then testimony starts. As testimony starts, we start to develop a thing called faith. And as faith begins to become part of our lives, that's when the miracle occurs. That's when the miracle occurs. Well, how do we acquire faith? How do we get from where we are to the faith? And faith is courage. Faith is the ability with courage to walk across that street, walk into the next office, take every opportunity we have to bear our testimonies. I had a great experience last Sunday night. I was interviewed on the Carol Hemingway show. I don't know if you're familiar with that show. I wasn't until last Sunday night. She called me up and asked me to come down. I said, sure, and I came down. It was a great experience. She let me bear my testimony and tell the Joseph Smith story and talk about the Book of Mormon. It was a great experience. And then some people called in. That was sort of interesting. But we had a chance to bear our testimony on the radio, and that was a marvelous experience. Well, brothers and sisters, why is it important to gain our own testimony? I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that in every age of time, since the beginning of this earth, when the Church of Christ has become a political and economic power, that the persecution has started and risen in direct proportion to that threat, that economic and political threat. When Christ was on the earth, yeah, they didn't like what he taught much, but the Sanhedrin and the Romans were a lot more concerned about the number of people that were beginning to follow him. And they couldn't deal with that, and so they got rid of it. When Joseph Smith and the people were starting to grow, they didn't like what he taught so much, but what they really didn't like in Illinois, that he was seriously considering running for the presidency of the United States. They believed in Illinois that he could do it. Governor Thomas Ford was shook by the Mormons. Nauvoo was the most beautiful, biggest city in Illinois, bigger than Chicago. And the persecution mounted because of the strength of the church. Well, I suggest to you that the church is once again, today, becoming an economic and political threat to a lot of people, and the persecution is beginning again, subtly perhaps, but it's beginning again. When Brigham Young stood up before the people in Nauvoo and said, I want you to follow me, we're going to go out to this really neat place out west. I'm not really sure where we're going, but it's out there and I know it's neat, and I want you to go with me. How many people do you suppose went with Brigham Young? This is a statistic that we don't broadcast in the church, but you ought to know it. 17% of the membership of the church followed Brigham Young. You know that? You ever ask yourself, why? Because it wasn't comfortable to follow Brigham Young. Leave my beautiful home here in Nauvoo? Go out there in a wagon? How many people do you suppose pay a full tithing in the church today? About 30%. How many go to sacrament meeting on a regular basis? About 33%. How many hold regular family home evenings? About 35%. Why? Because, brothers and sisters, we have not acquired the ability to find out for ourselves that the gospel of Jesus Christ is true. You can't bask on somebody else's life. You can be strengthened by it. When you're sitting on that hearth all by yourself, you've got to have light of your own, or it goes out. And there are a whole lot of lights going out, brothers and sisters, because they can't get around your light or someone else's light. Well, that's why I believe we've got to develop this testimony. And as that testimony grows, it translates into faith, and with faith comes great, marvelous works, and miracles occur then. I went into the military. I got home from my mission in 1965 from London, England, and I received one of those letters that reads like this. It said, congratulations, your friends and neighbors have selected you to represent them in the United States Army. I've been looking for those people ever since. I got drafted into the military. And I went to a place called Fort Polk, Louisiana. I don't know if you've ever heard of Fort Polk, Louisiana. When the world ends, it's going to start in Fort Polk, Louisiana. That's a bad place. Well, in basic training, brothers and sisters, in basic training, they take a bright, vibrant young American mind, and in 8 weeks, they reduce it to an undulating blob of green protoplasm. And I got there, and they took all my hair away and gave me a green suit and a rifle, and they were going to teach me to be a killer. Here I was just off my mission. I'm going to be a killer now. And in basic training, because 65 was the Vietnam year, the Vietnam War was rising at a great pace, and there was lots of people going through basic training. They put me in a barracks. And I don't know if you've ever seen a military barracks before, but it's very basic living. You know, it's got a roof and 4 walls and 2 floors on it. And they normally put 40 young men on one of these floors. And in this case, they had 60 because of the war. And they had double-deck bunks down both sides of this barracks. And the double-deck bunks were about that far apart. So when you went to bed, you had to sort of slip in sideways and shinny into bed. And there's this big corridor down the center. And then you had your foot lockers out in this aisle. Well, they assigned me to the top bunk of the very far right-hand corner bed. Got to be about 10:30 that first night, and I was feeling a little humiliated, no hair, and this green suit and everything. And as I was about to climb into bed, it dawned on me that it was time for Elder Smith to say his prayer. And I looked around, and there wasn't anybody else praying. And I thought to myself, and I stood there for probably 15 minutes, wrestling with all the reasons why it would be okay for me to leap into bed and say one on my back. I said, surely the Lord wouldn't mind if I just do one of these. Nobody would be offended, and it'd be real easy. After all, it's really difficult to kneel from the top bunk. And I thought he'd understand that. And I was going through this rationalization process, and finally, after about 13 or 15 minutes, Elder Smith said to me, you just came from England, Elder Smith, and you've been telling people for 2 years that it was critical to get on your knees and talk to the Lord every night. So I decided I'd better do it. And the fellow who slept under me had already gone to bed, so I bent down and tapped him on the shoulder. And I said, would you mind if I used your bed to say my prayer? And he looked at me like you look at a very strange thing. And he said, sure. And he got up and left. I never understood why he left, but he didn't want to be there. He just got up and left. And so I knelt down in perfect silence and said my prayers. I don't really remember, actually, whether I prayed or not, but I remember kneeling down. I can remember a very uneasy silence in about a 2 or 3 bed radius. And I could feel the fingers. You know, what's he doing? Got a little easier the next night. After that first night, the next morning, I was then named the Reverend. And I was called Reverend for the rest of my military experience. The next night was a little easier. The third night came along, and I was praying. We had a little ritual. This fellow underneath me, he'd get up and leave. One of the fellows came up to me as I was praying and kicked me. He says, hey, can I help you find what you're looking for? And I said, no, I'm saying my prayer. And he said, oh, okay, and he left. Well, the fellow that slept in the bed next to mine, remember we were very close, and if you rolled over in the night, it got really embarrassing, and so you didn't do that. This fellow who slept in the bed next to mine was a fellow by the name of Osmond. Osmond was from Kentucky. He was about 6'8", weighed about 280 pounds, no fat on Osmond. He had mastered the military vocabulary, which means he had a foul mouth. And he pretty well got what he wanted. He came up to me on one of the training ranges that we were on about the 4th day, and he said, Reverend, I want to talk to you. And I said, lay it on, Osmond. And he said, I've been thinking that I'd really like to have you pray for me. I've been watching you pray. And he said, would you mind praying for me? And I figured if anybody needed praying for, Osmond did. And I said, sure, Osmond, I'd be glad to pray for you. So that night as I was about to pray, he said, don't forget, Reverend, you're going to pray for me tonight. I said, all right. So I did. I prayed for him. Next day, we were out on the range again. He came up to me and said, Reverend, something's been bothering me. I need to talk to you. I said, all right. He walked off to where we were alone, and he said, Reverend, isn't it a little noisy in there when you pray at night? And I looked up at him and I said, yeah, I've got to admit I've prayed in quieter places, Osmond. And he says, well, I want you to tell me when you're ready to pray tonight. I looked at him and I said, well, okay, Osmond, I'll tell you. I forced it out of my mind. I didn't want to remember that, I guess, because I had forgotten that night, and I was getting ready for bed about 10:30. He walked up. He said, Reverend, you ready to pray? I looked up at him and I said, yeah, it's time, Osmond. He proceeded to walk out in this center aisle. He started with 7 of the foulest words you can imagine. And he said, I want quiet in here. Just like that, you could have heard a pin drop. All 60 of these young men on this floor came out to the edge of their bunks, and they were looking down that aisle. Here stands Osmond, all 6-8 of them, and here stands the Reverend. He says, I want it quiet in here while the Reverend prays. And he looked over at me and he said, pray. Well, there wasn't anything else to do at that point for the Reverend, so the Reverend got down in perfect silence that night and said his prayers. Well, it turned out to be a marvelous experience. For the next 8 weeks, I could not have gone to bed without praying if I'd wanted to. And I had to meet his schedule. One night I was in the shower and I had to come up and pray wet because everybody was This turned out to be a fun thing. He'd get them all quiet and I'd come up and pray and they'd call me Reverend, I called them Brethren. It was a great experience. The thing, brothers and sisters, that turned this experience into one of the most sobering experiences of my life was on the last day of basic training. You go through this military parade and they give you these little badges. If you can hit a target with 4,000 rounds of a machine gun, they give you a marksman badge, We got all our badges and we had gone through our... You've been there, You must have been in the army. After we got through with the parade that day, I discovered that 17 of the young men on that floor were members of the church. All 17 of them were from the state of Utah. All of them had been active in the church up until the day they came into the Army. Most of them had lost their virtue in Leesville, which is a nasty city outside of Fort Polk. All of them were smoking and drinking. Most of them had mastered the military vocabulary. You know how I found out, brothers and sisters? Each of them felt it necessary before they left to come up to me and apologize. And 17 times that afternoon, these young fellows would come up, handsome, strong-looking young men. Reverend, I think there's something you ought to know. I know the yes, too. And I'm not very proud of it today. I had to ride from Fort Polk to Jackson, Mississippi to get an airplane, and I'll never forget that bus ride as long as I live. I wept and I pled with the Lord, and I said, why, Lord? What happens to a young man who goes through the programs of the church? He goes through seminary and Sunday school and primary and all of the marvelous things that are available to us. And when he comes into the military, why? You know what the answer to that is? Because, brothers and sisters, there arrives a time in all of our lives when we have to find out for ourselves. We can't bask in our Father's light anymore, our mothers, or our bishops, or our stake presidents. We've got to know for ourselves. You know what the message in the military is when you get there? You want to be happy here, my friend. You better do what we do. You better think like we think, you better act like we act, and do all things we do. And if you don't want to do those things, you better not plan on being very happy here. You're not going to be in. And if you're not in, it's no fun. That's an incredible pressure. And they didn't make it. That's why I have an incredible sense of urgency, brothers and sisters, for each of us. Young people, every chance I get to talk to young people, I beg and plead for them to find their own testimonies, find out for themselves that God lives, find out that the Book of Mormon really is the Word of God. Because somebody's going to stand them up against the wall someday and ask them the question, do you really believe that? I had an experience when I lived in New York City for a couple of years. Really grew a great love for the theater in New York. My father, you might be interested to know, was a senior professor of speech at many universities and was a consultant for pronunciation for the Webster Dictionary. And he used to go to the Banff School of Fine Arts every summer and do a play. Great actor, my father was a great actor. And he taught at the University of Utah for a number of years. You might have known him. He's not saying that you're old, but you're close. I lived back in New York for these couple of years, and I was a young man. This is prior to my mission experience, and I was living with a very dear friend of mine, not a member of the church. I had a brush with some inactivity, and we came home one night after a late night of working, and we started to talk about religion, and he proceeded to tell me about his faith. He is a brilliant young man, has since graduated from Cornell University in oceanography, has a PhD, and is teaching at Rhode Island University. Bright guy. And he told me about the Baptist church, and he finished off what he said about the Baptist church by saying this. He said, you know, religion is great for kids and old people. We don't need it, do we? We're so slick. We don't need it. Tell me about the Mormon church. And so I began to tell him about the Mormon church, and I was ecstatic. It took me about 23 minutes to give him a core dump on everything I knew about the Mormon church. And I began by telling him the Joseph Smith story. And I had a very interesting experience as I told my very close dear friend, Artie Gaines, the Joseph Smith story. I said, well, you know, there was this kid in upstate New York. And I started to sweat. Because when I said upstate New York, I realized I was in New York City, and I wasn't very far away, a couple hundred miles. And I knew what I was going to have to tell him. I said, you know, he wanted to join a church, and so he went out into this grove of trees, and he knelt down and decided to pray. And, you know, while he was praying, he was praying there, his knee on the ground, and this great light came down. And Artie Gaines' eyes started to get about that big around. And I said, this light came down and shone all around, and, you know, and he looked up, and there were two men standing in the light. And Artie very quickly said, yeah, who was it? And I said, well, actually, it was God and Jesus Christ. He said, you mean they've been to New York? And I said, well, yeah, I guess they have. I never thought about it like that. And I proceeded to get off that as quickly as I could and finish my story, and I'll never forget what he said as long as I live. His eyes never got any smaller. After I finished this wild tale, he looked at me and he said, Hyrum, do you really believe that? And my conditioned response, the response I've been raised with, was to say, of course I believe that. How dare you ask me if I believe that? But because of the close relationship we had, we almost had a filial relationship. I had to look him in the eye and say, you know, Artie, nobody ever asked me that before. No, I don't know for sure that's true. And then his eyes got the regular size. He said, boy, I'm sure glad. You had me worried there for a minute. And then he rolled over and went to sleep. And then my eyes were about that big around. I lay there that night, a very shaken young man. And I said to myself, suppose it's not true. Heavy. Maybe I'd better find out. My family's been part of this for a long time. Maybe I don't know for myself whether or not it's true. And I began reading and thinking and experimenting and praying like I had never done before in my life. And I won't tell you how long it took, but over a period of years I began to develop a testimony that was mine. Gained enough of a one to go on a mission, and there it solidified and became much stronger. Several years later I went back to New York, took a special trip, and invited Artie Gaines to dinner, and I took him out. And said, remember that story I told you about the light and two men? Yeah, I remember the story. It's true. I want you to know, Artie, I know it's true, just as sure as I sit here tonight. And as a son of God, you've got to admit either it's true or it's not. Would you admit that? Yeah, I admit that. I said, as a son of God, you owe it to yourself to find out. Well, so far he hasn't done anything with that, but he knows that I know for sure now that it's true. But I, just like everyone in this room, at some time in our lives, have got to find out for ourselves. And if we'll do that, brothers and sisters, then it doesn't make any difference what the behavior is of anyone, right up to and including the prophet. Nothing can shake that testimony that the Lord has given to us as a gift. And testimonies are gifts from our Father in heaven. Well, step one, brothers and sisters, is getting that testimony. And from that great strength comes, and great faith will develop. Power will develop. Let me close with two quick stories of the courage that comes from faith. You know, if you'll pardon me, another military story. I had a great experience in the Army. The Army for me was a great time. After my basic training experience, I went to OCS and became an officer. I decided that I wanted to get married. My wife's father didn't want her to marry a private, and so I went to OCS and got a commission in the artillery. In OCS, which is Officers Candidate School, it's a 23-week school. In 6 months, they turn you into an officer. Very rigorous, interesting training. In the last 2 weeks of that, your rank in OCS is determined by your class standing. And I, because I had the opportunity of graduating as the undergraduate, had 4 diamonds on my shoulder. That meant I was a candidate general. I had more power in OCS than I ever had in the real Army. I got demoted to second lieutenant when I got graduated. Well, I had 4 diamonds, and I had a staff, and they all had different ranks. 3 diamonds, 2 diamonds, 1 diamond, diamonds all over the place. One night we were sitting in our staff office, and a brand new class of candidates had just come into the school. And as we were sitting there reviewing these cards, they had 3x5 cards, one for each of these new candidates. We were reviewing the personal data on these cards. One of my staff members raised this card and laughingly said, "Ha! We got another one." I said, "We got another what?" He says, "We got another reverend." Oh, they thought that was great. And they joked about it and laughed and handed me the card. Sure enough, I looked at this card in the bottom right-hand corner. It said, "Religious Preference, LDS." Right underneath that, it said, "Language Spoken, French." That told me something. And they kidded me about this for a moment. Then one of the fellows looked at me in a sort of half-serious way, said, "Reverend, do you suppose this new Mormon is as proud of being a Mormon as you are?" And I said, "Of course he is." And they joked and laughed about that for a few minutes, and then one of them said, in a very serious tone, "Reverend, how would you like to prove that?" And I said, "Sure. Come on." Well, you have to know something about OCS. Upperclassmen, there ain't anything worse than upperclassmen. Hated, despised, feared upperclassmen. And we had on our shoes, when we become an upperclassman, a horseshoe tap. Have you seen these horseshoe taps? They're sort of cleats. And you could hear an upperclassman for 4 blocks. We had our own paths that we walked on, and the lowerclassmen had to jump across our walks. If you ever got caught on an upper-class sidewalk, death to the lower class. Well, we put on our uniforms and our cleats, and we shined up our brass, and we marched over to this barracks where this new class was getting ready for bed. It was about 10 in the evening. And we walked into this barracks, and as is the military tradition, the first candidate saw all these diamonds, there were 7 of us, screamed at the top of his lungs, "Attention!" Everybody in that barracks froze. Another thing you need to understand about OCS is the barracks are a little different than the real Army. Floors are highly shined. You can see your face in them. They get that way because we use Johnson wax on our hands and knees. Lower classmen were not allowed to walk on their own floors. If they wanted to get to their bed, they'd crawl across the tops of their bed with their shoes under their arms. The only people allowed to walk on the floors were the upperclassmen. Well, we walked into this barracks, down the center of this aisle with our cleats, and just destroyed the shine on this floor. Of course, we intended to do that because we knew it would take them all night to get redone for inspection in the morning. We walked up and down this aisle for a few minutes, thoroughly intimidating everybody there, and all these candidates, first day in OCS, thought they were about to die. Finally, after we walked up and down this aisle 3 or 4 times, I stood at one end of this barracks, and I mustered one of my gruffer voices, and I said, "I want to know if there are any Mormons in here." Boy, you could hear a pin drop, and you could see them. So I was just wondering if anybody would dare admit that. Finally, down at one end of the hall, hand went up. So we stomped down there, all 7 of us, come on, in our pleated shoes, and I walked into the cubicle, and there stood Chuck Daly. I'd never seen Chuck before in my life. I walked up to Chuck and put my nose about that far from his nose, and I said, "I want to know if you're a Mormon." "Yes, sir." "Are you proud of being a Mormon?" "Yes, sir." And I said, "I'm sure glad. I'm Hyrum Smith." He fell apart and he put his arms around me, and I put my arms around him, and I had my arm around him. I turned to my staff and said, not a very humble way, "Told you so." And they stood there and thought, "Oh, gee, we got another." And then I introduced myself to the rest of these candidates that were standing in the room, and I said, "I want you to watch Chuck Daly. 6 months from now, he's going to graduate wearing 4 diamonds." And I turned to Chuck and I said, "Thanks, Chuck." I shook his hand and laughed, and I've never seen him since. 6 months later, I couldn't stand the suspense, and I was in Germany. I got back in touch with the OCS school, and sure enough, Chuck Daly graduated with those 4 diamonds. I'll never forget as long as I live, brothers and sisters, the majesty of that young man. Standing there, never having seen me before, not knowing what was coming, great pressure. That was a tremendously pressured experience. Unequivocally saying, "Yes, sir, I am a Mormon. And I don't care who you are, who knows it. I am a Mormon." Where does that kind of strength come from? It comes from having your own testimony. And as that testimony grows, faith grows, and courage comes with faith, and miracles happen with faith. Last story, and I'll be still. There was a man standing on a very high cliff, about 900 feet from the ground. As he looking over this great expanse, a great wind came up and blew him off the cliff. As he was falling, anticipating the greasy spot at the bottom, he cried out and said, "Oh, Lord, don't let me die." Just about then, a branch appeared on the side of the cliff, and he reached out and grabbed this branch. There he hung about 500 feet from the ground and about 400 feet from the top, and there was moss on the walls, probably in Portland, Oregon. Couldn't climb up and he couldn't climb down, and wondering what he was going to do. As he hung there, a voice whispered in his ear very softly and said, "Believest thou that I created the wind that blew you off this cliff?" And very quickly the man said, "Yea, Lord, you know I believe." And then there was a long pause, and the voice whispered a second time, very softly this time, and said, "Believest thou that I created the branch that broke your fall and saved your life?" And very quickly the man said again, "Yea, Lord, you know I believe." And then the pause seemed even longer, and the voice whispered a third time, this time almost imperceptibly, "Believest thou that I could create a wind to blow you back up to the top of this cliff?" "Yea, Lord, you know I believe." And then several hours went by, and the voice whispered a fourth time, this time just so he could barely hear it. And the voice said, "Let go." Now, brothers and sisters, we are in that position. The Lord is asking us to let go. Do you have the faith to let go? You know what Paul would have done? He would have opened his hand and enjoyed the ride back up to the top. I hear people all the time saying, "Yea, Lord, you know I believe, but home teaching's too much. Yea, Lord, you know I believe, but walk across my street and tell my neighbors I love them. Yea, Lord, you know I believe, but do my visiting teaching? Too much." I bear my testimony to you tonight, brothers and sisters, that the miracle is not going to occur until we, the members of the church, acquire testimonies that are our own. We develop a relationship with the Savior of our own. And as we do that, the faith will come. And as the faith comes, then the miracle will happen. But the miracle won't happen until we build the rocks. And our rocks, brothers and sisters, is our desire, our ability, our tenacity in going out and doing what the Lord has asked us to do. I want you to know tonight that I know the gospel of Jesus Christ is true. I know that Joseph Smith did see and speak with God and Jesus Christ. And that is the most powerful, magnificent message in the world today. I plead with you, people who have an opportunity in a big way to make this message known to the world, to strengthen yourselves inside so that when the heat comes and the opportunities come, and they usually come simultaneously, you'll be able to stand up and do what the Lord has sent you and prepared you and given you the talents to do. I bear this testimony to you humbly tonight in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.